This is the first of at least 3 videos I think I'm going to make talking about philosophy and politics and the future of veganism as a movement in relation to the 2015 book, Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach by Gary Francione. Gary Francione is, no doubt, one of the most important people in the history of animal rights, in the history of veganism. He is definitely one of the most influential voices in the last 10 years, and I do think his work will be remembered for the next 100 years. With that having been said, I am a critic of his work, and if you've been watching this channel regularly, you will have seen me criticizing his work in the past. However, criticism does not entail contempt. There are a lot of useful observations in this book that are worth discussing, and also his book is an occasion for us to ask ourselves serious questions about our own futures individually as vegans trying to change the world, and collectively, veganism as a movement. Why do I say I'm going to make several videos about this book instead of, say, just one long book review video? Well, one of my New Year's resolutions is that I'm really trying to bring more people onto the channel. So I've actually invited 2 YouTube broadcasters, who you may already know, to come online and discuss the book with me. And, both of them responded positively. And this is 2017 for you to say, oh, great. It's been such a long time since I read a whole book, cover to cover. We so often consume information in short snippets, little bits and pieces, videos on the internet, articles on the internet. We spend so much time managing and shuffling around information. To actually sit down and read a book from cover to cover sometimes seems like a luxury. It seems like a rare and remarkable thing in our lives. So I invited Maud Vegan. Maud Vegan, also known as Margaret, but I call her Maud. Maud Vegan's been featured on this channel in the past, and I encourage you guys to go check out her channel. She has a really good new video up about the leather industry. Interesting. And I also invited Klaus from Plant-Based News. Now, I assume those will be separate videos. And Klaus also, he said, oh, great, an excuse to read a whole book. We'll see if Klaus finds time for it. As of today, the last I checked, neither one of them has finished reading the book yet. I already have finished reading it. It's about 150 pages. If you guys want to read the book, you can join in too. But I could throw out some invitations to some other vegans who are really interested in substance here on the internet. Somebody like the Onion Knight, any of the vegans who are sincerely engaged in the political future of veganism. I'd be happy to have you guys on my channel and talk about this book and its implications. But I think each one of those people is probably going to find different aspects of this book illuminating and interesting, and they're probably going to find different aspects of this book problematic and important to criticize. So in this video, this is kind of just kicking off a series of videos. And I'd be happy if there were 6 different videos in this series. There's a lot of material. Why is there so much material? Well, okay, guys, if you've never heard of this book before, you have to realize Gary Francione is a former supporter of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And a large part of this book is really heaping scorn on PETA. It's a very harsh, castigating criticism. It's a condemnation of PETA. And it is not just a condemnation of PETA, it's a condemnation of all organizations similar to PETA, obviously including Humane Society of the United States. Now, I sympathize. It's funny. My whole experience, the vast majority of vegans hate PETA. But you do also have to ask yourself, looking back at the last 50 years, PETA, isn't it the single most successful charity or foundation in the world in this category of veganism, ecology, animal rights, ethics? And looking ahead to the next 50 years, it's actually entirely possible that they will continue to be the most successful. They may become more successful, and they have definitely become more vegan. Veganism has increasingly been part of their message and part of their strategy, whereas in the past, if you can remember back long enough, there's a time when it really was not. There was a time when they had actresses wearing leather boots in some of their promotions and so on. And yeah, there were a lot of reasons why animal rights activists. So to start with, the easiest way to tell someone who's never heard about this controversy before would be to say, what is Gary Francione's approach to animal rights? Well, in terms of praxis, he completely rejects PETA, and he completely rejects any kind of large, centralized animal rights charity resembling PETA. He embraces what he calls grassroots activism, and it's grassroots activism utterly focused on one-to-one, face-to-face interactions. So I'd encourage you, there's a link below this video. I made an earlier video responding to Gary Francione and specifically dealing with his comments on slavery and the abolition of slavery. But the emphasis in that earlier video was that I said, look, Francione, his abolitionist approach to animal rights, it's always saying that this is an issue as fundamental as slavery. He's really putting tremendous emphasis on this comparison between America's history of the struggle to abolish slavery and the struggle to abolish animal exploiting industries. But the historical reality is abolitionism in the United States was violent. Abolitionism involved the Civil War. Abolitionism involved a political struggle on a staggering scale that was everywhere from your local city hall to your local state senator to federal parliament. United States, they don't use the word parliament, but you get my point. The debates about the abolition of slavery totally consumed their political process, including party politics. And of course, it also consumed the country in a violent civil war that killed an enormous number of people. So it is somewhat bizarre that Francione's approach pairs this very dramatic, over-the-top, even the choice of the term abolitionist and abolitionism, he really chooses to hammer home and again. The center of his rhetoric is the comparison to slavery and the abolition of slavery, but the center of his political praxis is one-to-one friendly conversations, is just education, grassroots education as he defines it. And that really is, from his perspective, talking to people at the grocery store, talking to people at the gas station, striking up people on that human one-to-one level and educating them about veganism. He also mentions a few other methods like tabling, going to conferences, setting up a table, handing out pamphlets. But that is a really incongruous pairing. And if you've watched this channel before, you know my own approach to veganism is really more of a middle path. No, I do not want to have a civil war, but I really recognize the scale and seriousness and political nature of this struggle. And I do think it's something where we need to get organized. We need to get organized into foundations and charities. And in some ways, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals is a positive example in terms of their achievement. And we also need to get formally involved in lobbying government. Wherever you are, whether it's Canada or Germany or France, I think there are real legal and political challenges that are far beyond this grassroots education approach that he takes. So in this video, I'm just kicking it off. This is not a complete or compendious video. I'm going to talk about the issues that, from my perspective, come up in just the first few pages of his work. However, it's a very repetitive work. What he discusses in the first few pages, in many ways, he discusses throughout the entire book. The book is worth reading, but the same themes come up again and again. So look, his philosophy is very simple. If you want to convince people to become vegan, the way to do it is to present veganism in terms of property rights. Now, you've already heard me say that he links that to slavery. From his perspective, the fundamental problem with slavery is that it reduces human beings to being owned as property. Now, there are many, many ways in terms of both rhetoric and philosophy and politics and law to describe what the problem with slavery is or to describe why the abolition of slavery was a good thing. That's a very peculiar choice of words. I think if you ask the average American on the streets to define slavery, they probably would not do it in terms of property rights. And then he extends this to suggest that the way we need to broach veganism, the way we need to create the roots of veganism as a new ethical issue that's going to transform the world around us, is simply to educate people, to explain to people the concept of property rights, and that it is not moral for them to drink milk from a cow, because that milk is not your property. I think, just even keeping at this one simple point, we all have to admit to ourselves that must be the most ineffective form of activism imaginable. It's totally ineffective in English. I can't even imagine translating that method into Chinese or Hindi, any other cultural context in the world. And one of the reasons this seems so tone deaf, I think, is that his whole model of how to achieve a vegan world, it does ignore culture. Francione, by training, is a lawyer, and he really thinks that this kind of legal fiction, approaching this in terms of a legal analysis of the nature of property rights, is the most effective or most devastating way to convince people that they must become vegan, that there's a moral obligation on them to become vegan. But the reality is, we all know on a human level, face to face, if you're talking to a friend or a coworker, and for the first time they notice that you don't drink milk, or maybe you comment, you see them buying ice cream, and you say, I don't eat that stuff, I'm vegan. They might ask you sincerely, why is that? Maybe your friend asks you, maybe they've known vegetarians in the past. They say, what's wrong with drinking cow milk? If somebody asks you that, the worst possible answer you could give is to say, well, here's the theory of property rights in the Western legal tradition, and here's the way that connects to the history of the abolition of slavery in my analysis of the American Civil War. That's got to be the weakest, most dehumanizing, most ineffective approach imaginable, even if you're in California. And it makes no sense at all if you're in England, Germany, France, let alone Japan, Sweden, India, Jamaica. It's an America-centric view, but honestly, I can't even see it working in the United States. On that face-to-face level, and the face-to-face level is important, philosophically, politically, and otherwise, I think it would make more sense if you talked about nature, what's natural and unnatural, even though we all know that appeal to nature is in some sense a fallacy, even though we know that's kind of flawed and dead-ended. It can be very effective and very moving to say to someone, honestly, I believe humans should only drink milk from other humans. I think it's unnatural for a human being to get down on their hands and knees and suck the milk out of a cow's breast. Maybe that's not the end of the conversation, but maybe that's the start of the conversation, right? That has nothing to do with property rights. There's nothing to do with the abolition of slavery. The average person who is not already vegan, if you try to say to them that the problem with drinking cow's milk is that the cow is a slave, that's already a huge obstacle to convince someone that that's a rational or reasonable argument. Is very, very difficult. If someone's already vegan, it may be contentious. They may accept that. They may say, yes, I see the comparison to slavery. To make the comparison to the abolition of slavery, like this cow should be liberated and set free, again, this is getting a little bit abstract. But specifically within the slavery paradigm, to focus on the technical definition of property, that the moral problem with slavery is that people are accounted as property under the law, and that the moral problem with drinking cow milk is that the cow is the property of a human being. This is a tremendously weak basis for vegan activism. It's a tremendously weak basis for veganism as a philosophy, and I think it's a tremendously weak basis for political praxis. And I don't just mean that on the face-to-face level of explaining why a friend of yours should stop drinking milk, but that in itself, I think, is enough to illustrate how deep this problem runs in Francione's approach, the abolitionist approach, as he defines it. Now, again, the appeal to nature may be a fallacy. Maybe your friend is quick-witted, and when you say it's unnatural to drink the milk out of a cow's breast, out of a cow's udders, they may turn around to you and say, yeah, well, you know what? Toothpaste is also unnatural. So I use toothpaste. So what? So why shouldn't I do something unnatural? Something unnatural is not necessarily immoral. That's true. You can also have an appeal to fairness, to say, look, it's one thing for an animal to live in the wild, and then one day a bullet from a hunter's gun kills that animal, ending its life. And it's another thing for a cow to be born and bred, to live its whole life in a steel shed on a concrete floor just to produce milk for you. Is that strictly legal? Is that strictly rational? I've had many conversations like that where you approach people that way, a contrast between hunting a wild animal and a domesticated animal suffering its whole life until it dies just for human convenience. That can be a very effective way to start the conversation. Maybe it's not the end of the conversation. Maybe it doesn't define the whole movement. I could go on and on. Even the health approach. I've had many videos talking about that. Ultimately, I think veganism cannot be based on health claims. But there is a profound aspect to the fact that many people grew up believing that eating meat and drinking milk and eating chicken eggs, that this is necessary. So whatever suffering, whatever evil, whatever exploitation is involved, it's necessitated by the health argument. So even addressing in terms of the health argument, that not only can you live your whole life without milk and be healthy, you will in fact be healthier if you start drinking cow milk. That is actually a fundamental aspect of the vegan paradigm. Again, I'm not saying this to ridicule Francione, but he has lived in a kind of Washington, D.C. echo chamber. He's a lawyer. He talks to other lawyers. And I think he doesn't realize how absurd what he has to say about slavery is from just a normal layperson's perspective on slavery. Again, click the link below this video. I made an earlier video really focused on slavery, on how his movement misrepresents and exploits the history of slavery from my perspective. I just think they do a bad job of dealing with slavery and its implications. I'm not saying that slavery is a totally inappropriate comparison, but it is only one comparison. And in some ways, it's a problematic one. But then within slavery, he really wants to focus on this very narrow, logical, legalistic question of how we define property rights. And in the past, I've also questioned that. It's really a false allegory. The reality was that when black slavery was abolished in America, which is a very specific example in the world, there's a totally different history of how slavery was abolished in Sri Lanka. There's a totally different history of how slavery was abolished in Thailand. Totally, totally different. But in the United States of America, when slavery was abolished, all of the slaves, black African-American slaves, they already spoke English fluently because enough centuries had transpired since they were enslaved. They spoke English. They were born and raised in the United States. They hadn't just arrived from Africa. And as soon as slavery was abolished, they could speak for themselves. They could literally go to City Hall. They could go to the Parliament. They could go to the courthouse. They could give voice to their own rights and their own interests. They could get a job. They could pursue a career. They could try to enroll in a school. Obviously, America was still incredibly racist. I'm not saying it was easy. A cow cannot do any of these things. A monkey cannot do any of these things. It's just not the case that we can liberate animals and then have them speak for themselves, that they can become self-reliant, self-determining, that they can be, the situation of dependency between master and slave in the United States could end overnight. With a legal change, suddenly black people could be empowered to speak for themselves. Of course, it was still a struggle. And there is no way a monkey or a gorilla, let alone a rat, can speak for its own interests. Animals are going to be in a situation of perpetual dependency on humans. And even when you have a particular monkey in a laboratory being tortured to death for medical experiments, the interest of that monkey has to be represented by a lawyer, a human lawyer in a courtroom. So there are many ways in which this comparison is weak and misleading. By the way, in later videos, there are aspects of Francione's approach that are positive. And just to say really briefly, the whole book hates PETA, people with the ethical treatment of animals, and you get to hear him explain why he thinks his approach is superior to PETA. He also hates the utilitarians. There's a very harsh, uncompromising critique of Peter Singer. He completely condemns Peter Singer and the utilitarian approach to animal rights. And a lot of that material is good and interesting and worth reading. But I think my role is to actually help us progress beyond this model also, because there are some elements of there's some elements of the abolitionist approach that are also very weak or, perhaps somewhat absurd. So look, maybe that's enough. I mean, I have a lot I can say even about just that one issue. Okay, I'll give one more example of that. I mean, this issue of property rights, I've mentioned before, actually in our society, because property can't speak for itself, oftentimes we do have special classes of property. If you own a painting, an historical painting that's worth $1 million, you have limited property rights over it. If you destroy the painting, you can go to jail. If you own a building and the historical architecture is important, there are a million government regulations. The fact that you own something as property doesn't mean you have unlimited right to destroy it or do whatever you want with it. It is much more likely that the progress of animal rights and veganism will be through the creation of a special category of property whereby animals have more and more rights afforded to them, and human beings have to be employed to pay attention to those rights. What are the rights of a wild bear living on a nature reserve? That's a very difficult question. Under some circumstances, humans have the right to shoot a bear, not others. What are the rights of a domesticated dog living in the city? Not easy to answer. And to use the academic terminology within the field, the so-called citizenship approach to animal rights is very concerned about who will pay for veterinary fees. If animals get sick and need $5,000 worth of surgery, whose responsibility is it? If you abolish ownership, if nobody owns the dog, nobody owns the bear, those become very difficult questions. But the idea that we can abolish property, thereby abolish slavery, thereby liberate the animals in a close parallel to what happened in the United States at the end of the Civil War is in many ways surreal, and in many ways it's much more likely that we're going to have a process of creating special classifications of property for animals as property in the same way that we have special classifications for historical architecture, for statues, for paintings. And as I pointed out in my earlier video, it's a profound irony that in our society, a statue of a cow may have more rights than an actual cow. In many situations, you don't have the right to destroy the statue. It's an ancient statue, it's a valuable statue. There's a question of the public good, of the public interest, that's reflected in the protected status of the statue, and yet there is no protected status for an actual living, breathing cow. That's a fundamental contradiction in our Western legal paradigm, but the solution is not that hard to see. As one more example here, again, I just do not think that anyone would decide to stop drinking milk, to stop eating ice cream, or to stop wearing a fur coat because someone said to them, according to this philosophy of property rights, that's not your property. And it's very easy for me to imagine people being motivated, especially culturally motivated, by the idea, I would not wear fur because it is beneath my dignity. As a matter of dignity. And dignity is not a strictly legal concept. It's not a strictly logical concept. It doesn't fit into this kind of highly legalistic philosophical and political paradigm. But culturally, it can have tremendous power in people's lives. I was reading a story recently, George R. R. Martin story, in which someone says that he was willing to kill for the king, but not to lie for him. Like you could order him to go to war, but you couldn't order him to lie. You couldn't order him to cheat or steal. People will refuse to do things because they feel it's beneath their dignity. And it's very powerful, and it's culturally conditioned, and it's built up over generations. I think it's very easy to show someone a video of what goes on at a fur farm and say, in effect, you're too good to contribute to this. It's beneath your dignity as a human being to give money supporting this industry. You're better than that. You should be better than that. You should have a higher calling. You should have some kind of moral code that makes you object to this, where you won't, for the sake of vanity or convenience, put on a fur coat. Dignity is a much more powerful concept than property rights in this sense. And I have seen myself, because many times, many of the people I've converted to being vegan were already vegetarian. many people watching this, you've had this experience. You talk to a vegetarian and you really simply explain to them why they're too good to drink milk. There's a level in which you're saying to somebody, you already know the problem here. You already know what this is doing to animals. You know what you're signing on for. You know the industry you're supporting. If you buy and drink cow milk, if you eat this ice cream, come on. You're not that dumb. You're not that immoral. You're not that evil. You're too good for this. This is beneath your dignity. On a one-to-one level, which is part of what we're talking about here, that can be very powerful. Scaling it up on a political level, that can be very powerful. Can motivate a political organization, a society, a foundation, a charity. And over time, culturally, that can be very powerful. And maybe that's the sense in which I'm most alien from Gary Francione here. Francione, he is in some sense, I think, a Christian and a monotheist. And Francione, his whole model of talking to people face-to-face, one-to-one like that, I think it really is a lot like the Christian ideal of proselytizing, of that one-to-one in Protestant Christianity, in Catholicism to a lesser extent. I think that on a deep level, he's influenced by Western Christian culture, and I'm not. On the contrary, I'm really aware of the power and weight and significance of vegetarianism in Chinese culture, in Indian culture, in Buddhist culture, to some extent in Taoism, Confucianism, but in Asian religions and in Asian cultures, culture is in many ways the deeper and more profound change that we're aiming for here. And maybe that's why this emphasis on property rights and slavery and the abolition of slavery is so misleading. Because there's one thing for goddamn sure. In the history of the United States of America, you were not going to liberate the slaves through cultural change alone, right? They did it through a civil war. But I can almost say the opposite about veganism. In some sense, it doesn't matter how many laws we pass if we don't bring about the cultural change. We need to be in a situation where legislative change and cultural change are working hand in hand. That we have legal cases that draw people's attention to the cultural challenge. We have cultural programs and forms of education and engagement that instigate change in people's lives on a human level, that in a sense challenge the assumptions of Western culture and Western civilization, the assumptions of the last 1,000 years getting challenged and changed. But in so many ways, our struggle is cultural. And without protracting this video too much, one of the reasons why Francione doesn't want to talk about culture is that his abolitionist approach, he refuses to admit the effectiveness of any halfway measures. He refuses to admit that any good was accomplished by attempts to ban fur, just fur. It's a whole other topic. But the reality is, when we're thinking about it culturally, in many ways we know, even if you regard the old campaigns of the past, the merely vegetarian campaigns, PETA's old-fashioned campaigns that just focused on fur, but that kind of made people feel that meat and milk were okay while fur was evil, or that leather was okay while fur was okay. That's a deeply flawed strategy politically. I know that. I agree with Francione on one level. But on a cultural level, I also know and recognize that those experiments in the past, those attempts to challenge our culture of wearing fur, etc., they absolutely did create the basis for the vitality of veganism and vegetarianism today. They absolutely did. And Francione refuses to think in those terms. So there you have it, guys. My first video, I think of many. There's no doubt, as I say, Francione is one of the most important authors and leaders in this field, one of the most important of his generation. But I'm really speaking for the next generation. And in a lot of ways, I look at Francione's legacy as deeply flawed, in the same way that Francione looked back on Peter Singer's legacy as deeply flawed. And it's a very interesting book, but I think you can really see that the animus, the spark of life in this book, is Francione's hatred for PETA, hatred for the Humane Society of the United States, and his hatred for Peter Singer And you tell them it's a real hatred. And in some ways, that hatred has warped and biased his perspective about what is and isn't effective activism, always hard to talk about. And in some ways, his own background as a lawyer in Washington, D.C. has definitely warped his perspective. And as I think the examples talked about in this video already go a long way to showing what that problem is. Maybe it's a subtle and profound problem, but it is a problem. And we need an approach to veganism that is simultaneously politically savvy and culturally sophisticated. We need to have an approach to veganism that's explicitly political, that's about organizing, lobbying, influence at your local school board, at the mayor's office, at local parliament. We need a form of veganism that takes full advantage of living in a democracy where you have freedom of speech and the ability to be heard in the formation of policy. And in education itself. We do need to have a form of veganism that does much more than grassroots educational activism as he describes it. We need to have a form of veganism that's politically savvy, but we also need to have a form of veganism that is culturally sophisticated. We need to have a form of veganism that speaks to the politics of the moment, but also to the politics of the millennium. And it's the changes we make in our culture, whether that's building on the legacy of Buddhism or starting from a blank sheet of paper in California. In California is not the hardest place. Think about I have an email the other day from somebody in Romania. Wow, in Eastern Europe, trying to get veganism going. South of France, very, very hard. Some of these cultures are intensely enamored with meat eating. Their culture is built on the ideology of meat and alcohol being central to the enjoyment of life. Huge struggle to challenge that culturally. The political struggle is insufficient without understanding the cultural struggle. And certainly Francione's approach of just looking at education and grassroots, it's insufficient without those other two. I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. I hope you'll stick with this channel long term. And I hope you'll join me in whatever way you can in doing your part in that struggle for however many years we've got on earth. Because this struggle is not going to be over in a day, and it's not going to be over in a decade. This struggle is going to go on for 200 years.